и компаративист. А область интересов, вот как раз сейчас я потребовала от Эмери сформулировать максимально емким и в то же время широким образом область его интересов, что всегда трудно, каждый всегда это знает. Область его интересов — это общая эстетика и корпоративная эстетика, что для нас, видимо, самое. Джейкоб Эмери, тема обозначена у вас в программу, и ее сейчас рассмотрим. Да, еще последнее слово. Значит, если кому понадобится вода, она понадобится в такой жаре, и стаканчики, и бутылки стоят вот там, у вас за спиной. У нас нет времени на длинное взаимное представление, поэтому мы это сделаем по ходу перерыва, но когда будут задаваться вопросы, а они должны задаваться, ради этого мы и собрались, пожалуйста, для начала представляйте себя, что я такой-то или такая-то, откуда-то у меня такой вопрос. Языки общения у нас русский и английский, то есть вот на сегодня у нас только Айрон Эйдл не владеет русским языком, но ему будет туда и обратно перевод. Что касается Джейкоба, у него великолепный русский, да?
Еще предупредили, вещей не оставлять без присмотра, потому что здесь свободный вход и всякое
музей, следите за вещами. Да, после чего, пожалуйста.
Спасибо, Татьяна. Я прочитаю лекцию по-английски. Перед тем, как я начну, я хочу поблагодарить вас за присутствие сегодня и за ваше внимание. I'm genuinely surprised to find myself asked to give a lecture on the topic of world literature, since I very well remember 20 years ago when I attended a lecture on the topic myself that David Damrosch gave at Harvard when I was a beginning graduate student. And I remember that my first reaction was that world literature was sort of an idiotic idea, and that it was perhaps foolish to invent a new word, world literature, when it's already obvious that literature exists in the world, and without that world there can be no literature. And indeed, it seems in the last 20 years, as world literature has exploded as a method in literary study, largely as a compromise in the wake of the conflicts of the 1980s and the 1990s in the United States over how to construct the canon, how to balance in it the peripheral and post-colonial regions of the world, and the traditional European masterworks that have been at the heart of some literature programs, how to balance theoretical and abstract approaches to literature with methods of close reading and those of approaching texts. In this context, world literature has emerged as a compromise, in part because it's proven to be all things for all people. For some, it's a safe haven for great books programs, and for others, it's an explosion of the canon to introduce a wide variety of new texts from new cultural contexts. So, representing a range of visions of what literary study itself should do, the rubric world literature seems as capacious, as incoherent, and as full of possibility as the world itself. And among major thinkers who have adopted the term, I probably include thinkers as different as David Damrosch, who advocates a new mode of reading for those texts that have managed to pass beyond their original cultural contexts into other times and places and languages. Frank Moretti, who advocates big data approaches to literature and using computer algorithms to do something with that enormous mass of literature that none of us have time to read. Or the Warwick Research Collective, who wants to find some way of approaching the literary system as a whole, as it's become organized under global capitalism. The common thread in all of these cases seems to be some kind of awareness of economic globalization and the interconnected channels of trade and communication that underlie it. And this is present from Goethe's coinage of the term Literatur on into the present day. And I should point out that it's not just in literary studies that we see this compulsion towards the global. When I stopped in at a coffee shop to get coffee on my way into the Tolstoy Museum this morning, I noticed that there was a sign up on the wall of the coffee shop that said "Uznavай кофе, открывай мир," right? Or when I got on the airplane to come here, then there was a commercial that ran at the beginning of the flight that said, making the world smaller one flight at a time, right? So we're living in this world in which every commodity seems to be promising us some kind of access to the world as a whole. And it seems to me that of all of the commodities in the world, the cultural commodity that is literature has perhaps the best claim to actually being able to offer us some kind of perspective onto the globe, since the literary artifact speaks from a particular time and place to a potentially global community of readers. Pascal Casanova's fundamental book, Republic of World Letters, begins with a list of economic metaphors drawn from the deep history of literary modernism. Valery Labeau, Ezra Pound, Vladimir Khlebnikov. And then, of course, we can trace this all the way back to the coinage of the term in Goethe, where his breathless proclamation that the epic of world literature is at hand has to be contextualized in the context of Goethe's belief in a universal market of exchange for cultural concepts more generally, and even with his work as the Minister of Economics in the Duchy of Saxony. And then, if you read a book, an introduction to world literature, it inevitably begins with the quote from Goethe, and then a page later you get the equally canonical quote from Karl Marx, and there's maybe no need to stress the economic aspect of that citation, which reads, national one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures there arises a world literature. And this is typically cited in order to lend another kind of heavy and canonical voice to this notion that there's an inevitable progress towards something like a global harmony of voices, a world literature, an equal playing field where everybody can participate in the same discourse across the globe. But I never found anybody brave enough actually to quote the sentence in its entire context, so I'm gonna do that here. Marx and Engels, this is from the opening pages of the Communist Manifesto, suggest that the cosmopolitan character of the world market has come about because, quotes, all old established national industries are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. It's at this point that we encounter the line about world literature arising from the numerous national literatures. To be understood as part and parcel of this new global economy, in which cultural resources, too, are raw materials to be exploited, processed, and distributed by industrial means. World literature appears here not to be an elective community born of our open-mindedness, but as a historical necessity whose condition is colonial violence. A global cultural hegemony that, quote, draws all, even the most barbarian nations into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. In one word, it creates a world after its own image, end quote. So to champion world literature as a passport to other cultures, which is the way that it's most frequently encountered in undergraduate classes in the United States, is in this view a mirage that stems from the underlying impersonal, homogenizing imperial violence that remakes the whole world in the image of bourgeois life. 170 years after Marx wrote those lines, the scholars who quote them might find it sobering to reflect on their deeper implication that we are less a vigorous vanguard hastening the approach of the global epoch, as Goethe wrote it, than hapless observers of a historical force, responding, as the website of the Institute for World Literature at Harvard puts it, to the political, religious, and economic forces sweeping the globe. The most cynical interpretation of the rise of world literature is that it has gained traction in the American university, less for its innate intellectual merit than for providing convenient cover for university administrations to consolidate national literature programs, and to catch all departments of world literature with centralized administrative support and text taught in translation. The potential boost to enrollment and profits is welcome at a time when the arts and sciences are pressured to justify themselves on economic grounds. World literature hence responds to a prevalent sense that the world is changing, that there is no place for humanistic reflection, that the forces of the globalized economy have exceeded our traditional mechanisms of understanding and control, the displacement and disorientation of modernity. In this sense, the motives of world literature can be compared to those of international environmental movements or protectionist political parties and other efforts to adapt or mitigate the challenges of humanity exerting itself on a planetary scale. Although Harvard University's Institute for World Literature, created to explore the study of literature in a globalizing world, according to its website, advocates for the whole world and positions itself as a necessary response to globalization, a map of its affiliates necessarily reiterates economic geography. Raw materials from agricultural and extraction regions are refined by translation and interpretation for sale to industrialized populations in the North Atlantic, Pacific Rim, and Persian Gulf. David Damrosch, director of the Institute, acknowledges a risk of being ideologically complicit with the worst tendencies of global capitalism, that's a quote, and points out that scholars themselves are returned value added to the periphery after being educated at academic centers like his at Harvard. Whether we think of world literature as a mode of studying texts that circulate beyond their point of origin, as Damrosch does, or as the use of big data techniques to account for that majority of texts that do not circulate at all, and that Franco Moretti has dubbed the great unread, world literature tends to default to impersonal forces, market forces that govern the exchange of texts across international borders, computer algorithms that treat data in a supposedly neutral fashion, methodologies of chronicling cultural transfers that in fact internalize more profound biases of globalized economic and information networks, the logic of the free market, in which goods, and above all information, are to move effortlessly across borders. So I want now to draw your attention really to the absurd fact that I'm giving a talk right now in Moscow, and that in 3 days I will, with a brief stop in Paris, end up sleeping at home in Bloomington, Indiana. Something that would have been unthinkable at the time that most of my favorite books were written. And for my entertainment along the way, I'll have airplane screens and airport bookshops in Moscow and Paris and Indianapolis, and they'll offer me the same genres of books and movies, and in many cases, the same text. Although world literature at the present time exists precisely along the lines of tension and transfer between cultures and languages, marketplaces, and often student bodies, are more inclined to celebrate geographic and linguistic diversity than formal diversity. For example, world literature in the American publishing industry has become shorthand for non-European novels, and especially those Frederick Jameson has called national allegory, and Joseph Slaughter has analyzed as the world novel. And I mean here the post-colonial Bildungsroman, in which the coming of age figures the entry of his nation into the global liberal order and its structure of universal concepts. And just as an example, we might name Yasser Kemal's 1955 novel, Mehmed My Hawk, set in an isolated region of Turkey called the Thistles, controlled by a brutal feudal lord. In a plot that allegorizes Turkey's passage from feudalism to modernity, from parochialism to the international scene, and of course the entry of its author into world literature and his novel into the global cultural marketplace, the young hero breaks through the thistles that surround his home village into the world outside. And similar novels are found the world over, Kenya's Tonyo or Indonesia's Ter, correlated with political independence, integration into global capitalism, and the popularization of the novel as an imported genre in literary traditions newly integrated into the world system. We might compare them in some respects to the newly written national epics that sprang up across the new literatures of Europe in the wake of the Romantic movement, Elias Denman's Kalevala and its imitators, all of these epic poems which supposedly express the national spirit of Croatia, Lithuania, or Finland, but which are, in important respects, all exactly alike one another and all expressing the same idea. The preeminent novel of the capitalist age, and the one whose main branch grew together with the spread of global trade networks, although there are independent traditions in Japan and China, the novel is, in Moretti's memorable phrase, the genre that travels, and it still sells best in airports and train stations. In other words, while teachers and scholars have often attempted to approach foreign literatures on their own terms, and to valorize those texts that are most distinctive in order to learn culturally specific modes of reading, markets prefer texts that require no painful adjustment on the part of the reader. In the case of the post-colonial Bildungsroman, that means novels assimilable to the classic plot of Balzac or Stendhal, in which the passion and ambition of a provincial youth guides them to prominence in the capital and entanglement in high finance and political intrigue. Such plots speak to the reality so expertly described by Casanova in her analysis of the intertwined histories of world literature and globalized economy, that peripheral writers must struggle to achieve recognition in Paris, New York, or Moscow in order to percolate back out to the periphery and achieve acknowledgement in the world literary system. On the most abstract level, such plots are compelling because they invoke the structure and universals of the liberal world order, the separation of the individual from traditional culture, the surpassing of barriers that prevent free movement, and the accumulation of private property in an interconnected world. And the plot is so globally appealing because it reflects an aspect of our experience in capitalism that Balzac and Stendhal already intuited. I mean, the way in which obscure or personal or outdated or peripheral texts might, through some apparently irrational mechanism, become phenomenal overnight successes through their interaction with the global information economy. Any text at all, and sometimes very, very surprising ones, might on YouTube become a viral meme and then evolve into parody, new languages, new media, blog summaries, children's version, fan fiction. In this whirlwind of data in which a lifetime's worth of new video content is uploaded to YouTube every day, 500 hours a minute, 82 years every day, more culture than we could consume in a single lifetime is ours at the click of a button, if only we know what we want and have a spare minute to spend. Global connectivity has unleashed the idea of a level playing field. The wealth and fame of YouTube stardom is within everybody's reach, but it's haunted by the illegibility of its processes and a global reconfiguration of inequality. The fantasy of a level playing field in cultural as in economic life is clouded by immense disparities of access, not just between developed and undeveloped nations, but between disinvested rural and manufacturing regions and urban communication hubs. On the local scale, sublime concentrations of access and isolation exist even in urban technological centers, which rely for basic maintenance on cheap, uneducated, and migrant labor. In the United States, rich as it is in financial and literary resources, fully 14% of the population lacks basic literacy, while fully 25% lack full access to banks. And one expects that they're largely the same people. It's not yet clear how literary education or literary canon might scale up to handle the current massive flow of text. At least 2 million new titles a year worldwide, when even the most avid reader is hard-pressed to read more than 50 books a year or to know more than a handful of languages. As the Warwick Research Collective observes, with the global spread of capitalism, for the first time in history, the system of world literature has the first time become conterminous with our world in which we live. That is to say, the map of global literary transfers and networks is now also the world that each one of us shares. Contemporary world literature attempts to offer orientation onto this condition by identifying economic logics of expansion and exchange, embracing literary relations as a network of transfers analogized with world trade and communication networks. Theoretical considerations emphasize influence and echo, adaptation and mutation. All this is symptomatic of a more general trend towards the metonymic, whose starkest expression is perhaps the actor-network theory of Bruno Latour, who imagines the scholar's task as tracing a trail of associations between heterogeneous elements. Like a railroad network, which spans a continent, but in which every stop is a local one, Latour writes that there are constant paths that lead from the local to the global, although, crucially, only as long as the branch lines are paid for, and in his view, it is prohibitively time-consuming and costly to scale up to the level of the globe. Latour is both the sensible and the most radical proponent of a wholly metonymic method for our increasingly metonymic age, in which culture is propagated by networked media, and in which our brains are becoming habituated to bookmarks and hyperlinks rather than memorization and allegory. We're perhaps disposed towards description rather than interpretation, tracery rather than comparison. In the historical roots of world literature, however, we find the two approaches: analytic readings that document association or causation on the one hand, comparative readings that place work from disparate contexts side by side on the other, in order to generalize something about poetic function side by side. The first is exemplified by Herder's genealogy of language, which is claimed as an ancestor by contemporary theorists of world literature, including Damrosch. The second by the Schlegel brothers' efforts to evolve a comparative map of world literature across gulfs of time and space, treating ancient Greek poetry as a parallel rather than a predecessor to German Romanticism, or comparing the entirely discontinuous dramatic traditions of ancient Europe and contemporary Polynesia. Many of the more interesting directions in world literature at the present time struggle towards some reincorporation of the metaphorical into a life dominated by network functions. For example, the Warwick Research Collective's approach to magic realism as expressing a phase of semi-integration in which worlds of familiar objects and relationships are at the same time haunted by forces outside their purview, in communication with an unpredictable force that can erupt within the everyday at any moment, which is recognizable as a literary mode in the literature of Latin America in the 1960s or South Africa in the 1990s. Indeed, the very fact that the ecosystem of global culture generates out of the churn of textual transfers stable international forms, like the Bildungsroman or magical realism, suggests the ongoing need to account for them on some abstract level. So we have, on the one hand, an effort to describe the system of world literature as a network or a system of transfers and exchanges and passages of texts across borders. On the other hand, there's a promise within world literature that by following these methodologies, we'll be able to intuit some kind of picture of what the world is, to grasp as a kind of panoramic whole our place in the world and what that world looks like. Readings like the one of magical realism speak to a fundamental function of cultural artifacts, which is to produce a coherent picture of the world, and the difficulty art faces in approaching this task at the current historical moment. Every text can be read as a more or less distorted image of the world that produced it, as the legend of Persephone allegorizes the cycle of death and rebirth that sustained the agricultural order of ancient Greece, or as a quasi-mythological figure of contemporary pop culture like Spider-Man allegorizes the utopian promise and apocalyptic danger of technological development. And it's easy perhaps for us to see how Spider-Man, who's created through a technological accident and who defends a world that's constantly threatened by some kind of invention or technological displacement which will destroy it, represents the technological horizon of our world and the fact that our existence within it both depends upon technology and is threatened by the development of those technologies in apocalyptic directions. It's perhaps harder for us when we read the Homeric hymns to recognize that something like the hymn to Demeter and its tale of Persephone is also representing the economic horizon upon which the world depends. Without the seasons, agriculture ceases to exist and everybody dies, and the story is in the same way about a kind of threat to the order that sustains the world and constitutes the horizon of the world, and without which the world would cease to exist. In this sense, every literary text is a miniature model that allegorizes the world in which it's created and consumed, as surely, though perhaps not as explicitly or as ambitiously, as Dante's account of the cosmos in his Divine Comedy, which ends with the metafictional image of the scattered leaves of all the universe bound with God's love into a single book. And that book, by implication, is the one that we've just read. Dante stands at the heights of heaven and looks out for a panoramic view of the cosmos. Latour has objected that panoramas, like late capitalism, the ascent of civilization, the West, modernity, human history, post-colonialism, or globalization, see everything. But they also see nothing, since they simply show an image painted or projected on the tiny wall of a room closed to the outside. Latour's underlying metaphor is Plato's cave, that canonical illustration of a misguided worldview that appeals to the corruptible human brain. While grand narratives certainly project biases and falsify the universe they represent, I wonder what we give up as literary scholars by refusing them, given that artistic representations differ from sociological models, not least in their cosmological ambitions. Without those ambitions, the Divine Comedy would scarcely be worth reading, even if contemporary readers are unwilling to extend to it much truth value. Alberto Toscano has recently taken issue with Latour here, observing that his wholly metonymic method is itself reliant on cartographic metaphors. Toscano argues that to exclude the big picture prevents us ever addressing fundamental questions like, what does the world look like? How are human beings to picture a world so transformed by human activity that even the calls of birds and the temperature of the planet and the colors of the sunset have been altered? Utterly unintended consequences whose ultimate outcome no one can fully control or foresee. We have a sense now that we've all, through the totality of human history, contributed something to the making of the world, but we don't know how to see or how to act within that world now that it's been made. In a world so vast and discontinuous, we seem to lack the orientation onto the world that Frederick Jameson refers to as a cognitive map, that common worldview that thinkers like Friedrich Schiller or Georg Lukács perceived in the shared mythic narratives of the ancient world or in Dante's cosmology. An inability to cognitively years and contours of the world system is as debilitating for inhabitants of the globalized world, Toscano writes, as being unable mentally to map a city would be for a city dweller. Perhaps the nearest thing we have to a literary genre distinct to and prevalent in global capitalism is the conspiracy narrative, which spans high culture manifestations like the paranoid plots of Thomas Pynchon and the Demon Nabokov, as well as genre works by Gibson and Brown. The same logic that the plot of the world is to be unraveled by the intense mental effort required to project a responsible agent onto it all is also salient in political narratives and digital media. Thomas Elsesser has identified such narratives with cinematic texts like The Matrix or Black Mirror or Old Boy, which he takes to transcend national cinema through new forms of audience address. The genre Elsesser calls the mind game film mimics the logic of networked life. Instead of a single painterly point of perspectival orientation around which the world is organized, the viewer scans a fugue of screens for information, paranoidly aware that screens mine us for our data as well. This aesthetic can actually be seen as a bid for access to a genuinely global range of markets, since such films reward multiple viewings on a range of devices to allow for pause and playback, and since they cultivate fan communities dedicated to paranoid interpretation of clues internal to a disorienting text, rather than representing a familiar shared world through conventions that are culturally specific to only a single market. Viewers reduce an overwhelming mass of information to a single paranoid interpretation through a projected act of imagination, doing exactly what the tour wants us not to do, and yet, as Elsesser notes, the films are experienced as pleasurable, but also perceived to be relevant, thanks precisely to this function. Now, we might expect every form of economic globalization to reveal its own notion of world literature. So if our current thinking around world literature internalizes those aspects of global capitalism like growth and information economy and free trade and transfer, then something like the Chinese New Silk Road Initiative would imply a different system of global cultural relations, centrally planned rather than emergent. The pre-Soviet and early Soviet mythologies of a global economic order provide another instructive counterpoint to the present moment. And it's interesting that in recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest in Alexander Veselovsky's theories of syncretism and in Trotsky's theory of combined and uneven development, which noticed that not all regions experience modernity in the same way at the same time, and that archaic poetic forms reappear with new relevance in new contexts. Well, I want, in the last part of my talk, to turn to this extraordinary ferment of artistic activity that was coincident with the First World War and with the Communist International. The phenomenon that Svetlana Boy might have called an off-modern version of world literature, an eccentric offshoot of the main branch of history and a vision of what might have been. The scope of futurism's influence in the West often goes unappreciated. The structuralist theory of Roman Jakobson, on which, or in opposition to which, much of what we now call literary theory develops, began as an analytic corollary to Vladimir Khlebnikov's fantasy of a single world language reflecting the whole itinerary from New York to Moscow. The project of a universal literary theory can thus be traced back to the dream of a universal literary language that would reflect the whole world, a dream that resonates with the contemporary need now that we have come to inhabit an immediately and evidently global economic system for aesthetic tactics to intuit and orient ourselves onto that world in its totality. Khlebnikov's 1910 poetic manifesto Zvirinets, which begins with the invocation Osat, Sat, and comprises a list of animals with poetic epithets, is already an allegory of an interconnected world. Its various peoples, prevented by the barriers of linguistic difference and national territory, from entering into the state of that other literary garden, Kreisvisat, in which all species coexisted peacefully. The origin of language as well as life. In Eden, each species was given a true name in the fabled language of Adam, in which, according to mystical traditions of Judaism and Christianity, words were identical with things, and every speech act was an incantation, until, with the Tower of Babel, the language of Adam fell into a system of opaque dialects and national rivalries. Heavily influenced in the construction of his lines by Walt Whitman, who had been translated into Russian in 1907 by Dmitry Tchaikovsky, Khlebnikov experimented with universal language in his most notorious poetic device, Zaumny Yazyk. For Khlebnikov, Khrushchev, Kamensky, Gurov, Danevich, and others, this specifically poetic idiom served variously as the inscription of abstract concepts to discrete phonemes, as an etymological recovery of the sediment of language, or as the defamiliarizing representation of spoken language, or as that stage of non-representation through which poetry must pass, just as Malevich's iconic black square was supposedly the 0 degree of painting through which visual art must pass in order to claim its future. And in fact, Malevich's first black square was painted as part of the set for the 1913 Zaum opera Pobjeda nad Solntsem. Although it can be compared to experiments in sound poetry carried out around the same time by Christian Morgenstern and the Dada poets, Zaum was incomparably more developed as a technique and more embedded in a mythology. Coined by Alexei Khrushchev, the neologism was the triangulating point generated by the opposition between umni and ni-umni, smart and stupid. It was to transcend in a new dimension the logical constraints inherited from the Enlightenment rationalism. The economic logic becomes plain in Khlebnikov's 1919 manifesto, where he analogizes national languages with economic protectionism. As languages разделили новые языки человечества на основные таможенные борьбы на ряд словесных рынков, за пределами которых данный язык не имеет хождения. In an apparent gesture to the utopian economic discourse of the early Soviet period, Khlebnikov envisions a language common to the globe to be organized along collective lines, in which each word is like a small collective, the first sound of the word being the chairman of the collective, directing the whole set of sounds in the word. So here the poetic principle of alliteration, the meaningful repetition of initial phonemes, is elevated to the ideal of a planetary language analogized with a planetary economic order. The technological correlate of Zaum is the airplane, which represents the abolition of distance and the transcendence of biological human limits through the ascent into a higher dimension. Vasily Kamensky was himself an aviator, and the theme provides an important point of continuity between early works like Pobjeda nad Solntsem, with its messianic aviator hero, and later Soviet works. So this, I guess, is how we get from early Mayakovsky lyrics like Aeroplan Krivko и упал туда, где уранило солнце вытекал вас, and late poetic works like Вот я чего мужику самолет. The link between panoramic perspective and non-representational uses of aesthetic media is evident in the revolutionary abstractions of Malevich, initiated by the black square. In one of his essays, he describes how in the future, genetically engineered sheep will grow yellow and red wool in order to save human beings the trouble of dyeing. And for aviators of the future, looking down at the rationalized globe, these grazing herds would form squares and circles on the canvas of the earth and look just like one of his suprematist canvases. From the panoramic perspective of future technologies, his paintings are actually legible as representations of the world system, revealed to be a kind of artwork fully shaped by the collectivity of human beings. Khrushchev's 1913 manifesto poem, Mir končился высоты, is divided into two halves. As in Pobjeda nad Solntsem, the first half represents the destruction of the world, but more or less obeys conventions of time and space and language, while the second is written in an explicitly universal language, Tsilinskiy Yazyk is subtitled, and seems to suggest a transrational future world beyond those conventions. In its first lines, Mir končился, умерли трубы, птицы железные стали лететь. We already have the apocalyptic subtext of the Last Judgment with the trumpets and the aerial theme. At the end of the world, these steel airplanes have replaced the organic birds that are traditional symbols of the poet. Over the course of the two stanzas, written in more or less comprehensible Russian, the gaze sinks from the heavens of the angelic trump in the airplane to the level of the water, and then below the surface of the earth in images of silt and sediment and the beard of the devil spreading out like roots in the center of the earth, the archaic depths of the world and history and the origin of language. The second half of the poem, entitled Vysoty, Tsilinskiy Yazyk, consists only of vowels. So the yeah, oo, you, ee, ah, yeah, and so on and so on. And it enables us to read the imagery of the airplane and its opposition to these diabolical roots of language to God and his angels as a revision of the legend of the Tower of Babel. The airplane, the fruit of the collective technological progress and achievements of humanity, has allowed the species to assault the heavens and claim for itself the powers of God and the original magic language of Adam, which in the biblical myth was scrambled into national languages in order to prevent human cooperation on a planetary scale. Cruciani's poem is now legible as a rewriting with a different outcome of that classic of world literature, the Bible, and specifically of that section of it that denies humanity a common global literature and a common global project. The bizarre and marginal futurist text is thus a transposition and inversion of the most canonical text in the Western world, with futurist airplanes superseding the tower and ending with the recovery rather than the dissolution of a universal language. The general strategy of co-opting canonical texts into eccentric literary spaces via translation and rewriting is consistent with accounts of literary struggle, like the parallel example of James Joyce's rewriting of the same myth in his own eccentric effort to create a universal language through etymological play in Finnegan's Wake, which Damrosch calls the most global text ever written. In fact, that inscrutable sequence of vowels that makes up the second half of the poem is a deformation of another canonical text, the Old Church Slavonic version of the Nicene Creed, from which all the consonants have been removed. Thus, the first word, vieruju, becomes e-u-u in Cruciani's version. We can take a slightly earlier Crucianic manifesto to explicate the method. Согласные дают быт, национальность, тяжесть, гласные обратные, вселенский язык. Thus, the invention of the airplane, which ignores national boundaries and defies gravity, like the elimination of consonants, which Crucianic imagines as something like the iron bars of Plednikov's menagerie, barriers without which the zoological sad might become a raiский sad, each of its members mingling in a universal poetic tongue. As in contemporary accounts of world literature, an inheritance of the world's classic texts is opened up and made global, but in the futurist version, this is a poetic rather than a scholarly project, accomplished not by transit across borders, but by their abolition, not by a carefully traced network, but by a panoramic intuition from a higher dimension. In this astonishing blend of nostalgic myth and futurist fantasy, canonical and avant-garde texts, we see a coexistence of scales of time and cultural orders whose discontinuity gave rise in Russia to the most fully formed tradition of sound poetry in the literate world. The ruptures and unevenness of global capitalism's penetration and function may in Russia at the turn of the 20th century than in Western European countries, which already felt themselves on the forefront of history and whose reliance on feudal labor took largely out of sight in distant colonies. Modernity, our current condition, consists not least in these discontinuities, which turn the time of human historical development and capital accumulation into the space across which texts and other resources are transmitted. Now, Klimika derived from Tchaikovsky's translation of Whitman the poetic technique of free verse unfolding through an itemized series, and Whitman got that from sources including the King James Bible. Yet, Klimika's Zvirinus also intuits something expressed in the dedicatory poems of Leaves of Grass, which I believe were not yet translated in the version that you read. These speak to a deeper affinity between the literary orientations of those two utopian nations, Russia and America, each struggling to define itself against Western European traditions, the language of each developing in vital and revolutionary directions in the late 19th and early 20th century. Dismissing English literature as insular and cramped, Whitman rejected its European past in favor of the American or even global future he imagined for it, claiming to be the singer of modern man and even to project the history of the future. Presenting his poetic rhythms as the pulse of America and his variable line lengths as America's expansive breath, he addresses himself to other nations in the inscription to foreign lands, writing, "I heard that you asked for something to prove this puzzle of the new world. Therefore I send you my poems, that you may behold in them what you wanted." And note the double meaning of new world here, which is at once geographical, America, and at the same time temporal, the new world of the future which America represents. Gertrude Stein, the impresario of the American avant-garde, writes in a similar tone that America created the 20th century, and since all the other countries are now living or commencing to be living a 20th century life, America, having begun the creation of the 20th century in the 60s of the 19th century, is now the oldest country in the world. Like the Zaum poetry of the futurists, or Trotsky's claim that Russia was the vanguard of revolution despite its historical backwardness, these statements of literary independence are insight from what was at the time the literary periphery into the nature of global modernism. Far from an unfolding map of progress, as Marx or Goethe had it, global capitalism is articulated through the ruptures and persistences and inequalities that make world literature, at least as a fantasy of the transparent and free association of cultural commodities, remain ever at hand. And of course, it's madness, if not simple stupidity, to believe in a trans-dimensional point of observation that is external to history, or in a universal language, as Demika ruefully jokes in his dramatic Sierpovest Zangizi. After a climactic chorus of gods recites a poem constructed around morphological play with the Russian root boom, there comes a sort of epilogue, which mentions that Zangizi has committed suicide. And at that point, Zangizi walks on and says, Zangizi živ, это была неумная шутка, words that many readers would apply to the play itself. I want to close now by referring to what I find to be a very poignant and enigmatic spot in a novel written by Ilyas Danilevich, who himself represents a kind of synthesis of the international avant-garde, the child of Georgian and Polish parents, a futurist poet in St. Petersburg, who collaborated with Kruchonik back in Georgia in the group 41 Degrees, later an emigre in Paris, where he collaborated with Zara and Ernst and Picasso and Miro, and developed an organization that facilitated cooperation between Russian emigre writers and the French avant-garde. And he developed this fine line between the Zaumni and the Niumni in his 1926 novel Воскрешение, a bandit tale that borrows many techniques from popular fiction, but is at the same time an allegory of the aims and failures of the international avant-garde, set in a mountain village whose name is too long and complicated to be pronounced even by its inhabitants. Деревушка с невероятно длинным и трудным названием, столь трудным, что даже жители не могли его выговорить, славилась тем, что населена исключительно забатными и кретинами. And then these cretins выползали обыкновенно по вечерам, не обращая внимания на непогоду, и распевали заумные, совершенно наподобие названия деревушки построения в жизни. Danilevich's joke is that the Zaumni has collapsed back into the Niumni. Poets are foolish. The futurist techno-utopia of universal poetry has degenerated into a poor, isolated pastoral, and the world of humanity united has become a pair of inbred tribes. Zaum poetry remains a project of the heights, but from this panoramic viewpoint, it's practiced only by poets who, wedded to the futile project of naming their own village, can talk to no one outside it. And yet, this panoramic perspective and poetic experiment remains the attempt to discover, through poetic experiment and permutation, the home of universal language, Babel, the city that human beings come from, whose name means confusion. These are exiles from the language of Eden who are trying to find that language again. An elegy for an incantation of the creative origin of language, this song reenacts the vital origins of poetry, the precedence of rhythmic construction over the signifying function, which appears in non-literate societies, especially in incantatory contexts, and in representations of the language of the dead, and which persists in the modern world, especially in avant-garde poetry and in popular music. We might think of this song as an effort to create a bridge between the poetic function's cultic context of mourning and resurrection, and its place in a future world of technological mediation. More broadly, we might think of this song as the sustained effort of poetry at unique times and places to name the place where poets live, which is the place where we all live, which is the world. Especially
Thank you, Jacob, for this very rich talk that offered so many bridges between economics and politics and literature and aesthetics, and you started with that, and then bringing us to this fascinating idea that we really need avant-garde to get at classical canon in a useful way, or possibilities of its resurrection in the future. We have plenty of time for discussion, and I'm sure there are many questions, since Jacob managed to squeeze into this art talk almost everything, or much of what we shall be discussing over the 3 days. In in any of the two languages, на любом языке, please questions or whatever, крики души, недоумения. Только представляйтесь немножечко, чтобы мы представляли себе, как мы и кто мы по отношению друг к другу. Здесь очень неудобная рассадка, она будет поправлена, когда мы переедем вниз, там будет круговая рассадка, а здесь вот такая противящаяся дискуссии, нет круглого стола, но тем не менее. Пожалуйста. Да.
Hi, my name is Anya.
Только погромче, пожалуйста, потому что иначе...
Hello, my name is Anya. A very short question. You mentioned that world literature is swerving in the direction of impersonal forces. Does that mean that it is an anti-hermeneutic enterprise?
It's a great question. Yeah. My sense is that there's a tension between the two. My feeling is that in classes and in scholarly work as well, there often is an anti-hermeneutic and anti-theoretical tendency. There's a shift, especially perhaps in something like Moretti, away from the notion of reading and understanding the individual text in favor of sociological methods or historical methods that describe patterns of production and reception, especially in institutional contexts. My sense at the same time, though, is that when we're talking about world literature, we're necessarily invoking the hermeneutic circle on the very grandest level, because we're trying on some level to bridge our experience of literature, which is always one of reading something, right? Reading individual texts, and then the very largest whole that there is, which is the world, right? Everything that human beings know and do. And so part of what I've tried to do in this talk, and so thank you very much for this question, which really goes to the heart of what I was trying to do, is argue once again for the absolute necessity of reincorporating hermeneutics into these methods, which can frequently stray into the descriptive or the sociological. If only because that was what artworks themselves are trying to do, and we're not really understanding what literature does without understanding them as attempts to picture the whole.
Yes.
I'm Ira Nadell from Canada. This is a terrific summary, but I guess I could say I'm worried. And is the emergence of world literature as a concept in reaction to the threat that we are all aware of to literature, to reading? And I'm thinking also of your opening comments about the institutional study of literature in North America in particular, and the way in which the humanities are repeatedly and consistently, this isn't new, under threat, administratively, economically. And so we will turn to digital humanities as a way of explaining to a dean why I deserve as much money as the people in, electrical engineering or computer science. So essentially, do you think the notion of world literature as it's developed in the last 25 years is a reaction to the threat to reading?
I absolutely do, yes, and I tried to suggest towards the beginning of my talk that that world literature is the expression of historical forces to which the humanities are being subjected, and it's become so popular in part as you say, as a rhetorical strategy of communicating outside the humanities to disciplines like economics or computer sciences, which have wide currency, and saying something like, the world is becoming globalized, so we're relevant because literature is also globalized, right? We're saying the world is becoming one dominated by information technologies, and so we too are using these tools to look at literature as information. And it's often disingenuous. My sense is that when you actually walk into a world literature classroom, you often get something like historically contextualized close readings of texts from the ancient world and from a spread of modern texts across the globe that would have remained in many ways quite familiar to a scholar from the 50s and the 60s. Perhaps the difference if we're talking about a classic text is, I think that we more and more rely on digital adaptations or fan fiction or cinematic versions of texts as pedagogical tools in order to communicate with our students. And I think that we see in that something like combined and uneven development, or the combination of different scales of time and media just within the syllabus, which is forced by the nature of the subject to take texts that belong in their context of production to a time before even the technology of writing had been developed, and then they're combined in the syllabus together with genres that express very different times, and then increasingly digital genres as well, which are included perhaps as portals of access to interest students in these other texts. Right? So it performs an important rhetorical service both for the students and for the administration.
Yeah, but surely that impacts on the concept, notion, experience of language.
Mm-hmm.
If I have to bring in the film version of James Joyce's short story, The Dead, I find that essentially negative, not positive.
It's problematic, definitely.
Well, your description is correct, and I mean, this is what you have to do in the classroom today, but I think the ultimate accomplishment isn't really an accomplishment, in the sense that literature is language, and it's about exposing ourselves to style in a variety of complementary, not competitive, complementary discourses, linguistic discourses. But if the only way I can get a student to understand what The Dead is about is by showing the film, I'm not sure it works.
Yeah, but I think that's absolutely right, and that's why I tried to describe it in sort of very brutal terms in the beginning of the talk. It's a response to a historical necessity that I remain very ambivalent about.
May I join Ira in this question, because I think this touches on what is really key and most problematic. As I understand, this rhetoric that you both are referring to has been in use in the United States, in the American Academy, for a longer time and probably on a larger scale than certainly in Russia or probably elsewhere. So you are probably more aware of the gains and losses that it entails. And my question is whether it's really an issue of not so much, progress or conservatism, but also of relevant riches, in that a richer university can afford to not to use this logic, because you can concentrate on literature proper, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and there again you see something like combined and even development, where in one city like Boston you have Harvard, at the same time you have the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and they serve entirely different communities and have entirely different resources at their disposal. And if you're at an institution which is wealthy enough to insulate itself from the pressures of economics, and which attracts a student population which has been trained from birth to be familiar with the written word and to read well, something that's not universally the case, then you have a great deal of room in which to start with the written word and go, right? And to communicate on that level with the deans, with that expectation. At many other colleges, I do feel that you need some kind of outreach and contextualization, both in your communications with the administration and in your communication with the students. And while we might regret having to move outside of our own logics to do that, and outside of our own priorities to do that. I don't feel that it's a damaging compromise necessarily. It's really just good pedagogy to be able to frame problems in terms that your students can understand, so that you can then lead them towards the crux of what you're trying to get at. And it is true, especially when we move into the contemporary period, that if our larger goal as, I teach in a comparative literature department, right? So there's film, there are all sorts of things going on. If our larger goal is to teach students how to orient themselves critically and be able to engage wide ranges of cultural texts, I don't think that it's amiss to teach students how to move between, say, visual representations and representations in written language, right? That kind of literacy and medial transpositions, I think, is quite relevant and useful, and in fact has a long history in more ancient traditions in terms of expressus, dialogue, paintings, things like that, right? So I don't feel that that's actually outside the purview of our methodology, even though it can feel a little bit cheap when we start off a class with something that feels only slenderly related to the subject at hand.
Yes.
Артем Зубов, МГУ. Спасибо большое, это было очень интересно. Мне кажется, что все-таки многое очень поменялось в последнее время именно с появлением интернета, потому что вот сейчас понятно, как никогда люди много и пишут, и читают больше, чем когда-либо до этого. И мне кажется, что вот сейчас все-таки есть очень большой разрыв между, с одной стороны, рынком литературным, а с другой стороны, вот тем, как люди используют литературное письмо для передачи своего личного опыта. То есть, например, на современном литературном рынке, как из России, я думаю, за рубежом, есть какие-то сегменты, какие-то темы, которые вот, не поднимаются, да, они не пишутся. Соответственно, читатели, которые могли бы этими темами заинтересоваться, они обращаются к блогам, к сайтам, на которых конкретные люди этим своим опытом делятся. Конкретный пример, не знаю, вот мигрантская тема в русской литературе современная как-то вот нет. Соответственно, если эта тема так или иначе читателям интересна, понятно, что они пойдут на блог, где конкретные люди, иммигранты или не иммигранты, будут этот опыт транслировать. И, соответственно, если пытаться как-то применять разного рода теории или подходы к анализу мировой литературы, которые вы описали, например, к современной ситуации, то тогда не очень понятно, собственно, что они анализируют. Они анализируют тенденции на рынке, и они анализируют, собственно, как литературное письмо используется для передачи личного опыта. И мне кажется, это очень большой разрыв, по крайней мере, на современный момент большая проблема. Что в итоге анализируется рынок, мода и тенденции рынка, и анализируется именно литературное письмо, его возможности.
Yeah, I think it's a very apt comparison, and I guess I would point out that this enormous gulf between these medial functions has existed for a long time within writing as well, right? So along with sort of the internet or photography, writing is a medium which has a wide range of utilitarian uses in personal letters or in work life memos and to-do lists and things like that, in addition to its aesthetic or its literary function. So it seems to me that when we translate this into the digital marketplace, we have some compulsion for interconnectedness, and we want to somehow integrate, if only on the level of cultural studies, these with the way uses of media technologies, which are so different in different cultural groups and often very isolating for different cultural groups. Often you'll find that these technologies are used to facilitate communication within one group and build that identity rather than to facilitate communication across those groups. So there's a very isolating function to those as well. I feel like we're dealing with a more ramified development, perhaps, of something which has existed since the beginning of technologically mediated communication and quite possibly since the beginning of language and conversation. And so what we're dealing with is on some level the problem of distinguishing aesthetic experience or aesthetic artifacts from other kinds of artifacts, which has plagued us since Aristotle, right? And we see that as a more pressing problem, perhaps, in the current day, since we do have this notion that that literary study has expanded to include more sociological methods. We have a better sense of literature as being produced within these global and interconnected media systems, and we want to connect them back in a powerful way to the everyday uses in everyday circumstances of technological media. My suggestion, I think, is that cultural texts do that by registering, sometimes even on the level of their formal structure, the ideologies and assumptions and the uses of language that exist within the voice medium.
May I add to this question a little? Could you specify, I mean, it's a terrible question, but still, what is it that distinguishes an aesthetic artifact from that other kind of artifact? So what is this, where in this logic lies the distinction? What can be discussed?
I believe that we're in an age in which our traditional ways of forming that distinction have become more difficult to enforce and recognize. I'm thinking of observations like Stian Guy's, that we exist in an age of the hypertrophy of the aesthetic, right? Where we walk through this landscape of advertisements, all of which are appealing to our emotions and to our senses in order to affect our behaviors, right? So these are, and many of these techniques actually developed within the avant-garde that have now been co-opted into contemporary advertising, right? So, so that the aesthetic has kind of leaked out into our experience of everyday life in many of its methods. I think that there's the sense that everybody is an artist, as Joseph Beuys put it. It feeds very easily into contemporary logics of labor. So if we're all creative people and everything we do is an act of art, then it means that we should be very glad to be working all of the time and grateful for the opportunity to create, even if our pay is poor, right? So there are these logics of capitalism that I think integrate very well with this hypertrophy of the aesthetic. So it seems to me that there is this aesthetic potential in the world, and every object in it can be sort of framed or recommended to our aesthetic potential against the background of that larger world, but that the aesthetic has to do precisely with that moment of framing that activates that kind of tension between the object that we're paying attention to, which requires of us a particular mode of attention. And that mode of attention, I think, can vary, but it requires that we place this object against the background of the larger world, which becomes a kind of frame for it. I think that we're at a moment in human history in which it's become evident to us that there's nothing in the background of our lives that hasn't been created by or affected by human labor, human activity, and that it's essential that we retain for ourselves these framed spots, which are artworks, from which we can stand and pay a particular kind of attention to this object and how almost panoramically it relates beyond itself to the outside world from which it sprang and which it tries to represent.
Здравствуйте, большое спасибо за ваш доклад. Я прошу заранее прощения, если мой вопрос покажется очень наивным, но я в нем вижу некоторые противоречия, потом я скажу, из-за чего я к нему пришла. Вы в своем докладе использовали такую риторику, как сеть, панорама, и вообще говорили об огромном объеме данных. И такая ситуация коммуникативная, она предполагает, что человек перестраивается с такого медленного чтения на чтение сканирующее, чтение более поверхностное и так далее. Как вы эту технику чтения, которую нам навязывает технология, связываете с тем, что до сих пор самым важным, самым почетным жанром является большой толстый роман, который экономически является очень выигрышным и таким символическим капиталом обладает. И такой фон за этим вопросом у меня скорее личный, потому что я сейчас перевожу статью о том, как формалист Виктор Шкловский воспринимал Чарли Чаплина. И как они пытались вписать Чаплина в культуру современного движения, в биомеханику и так далее. И самое смешное, что они вписывали это даже не видя фильмов Чаплина. И это опять возвращает меня к вашему докладу о том, что, возможно, то, о чем мы говорим, вот этот огромный масштабный поток глобальной литературы, он путешествует не за счет именно текстов, с чем мы обычно сочетаем литературу, привыкли ее ассоциировать, а за счет мнений о этих текстах. Потому что если я открываю свой ньюсфид в Фейсбуке, я вижу подписку на литературные издания, которые говорят мне, эта книга такая-то. И это тоже некоторый культурный транс. То есть, как видите ли вы в этом противоречие? И, может быть, это что-то, или есть некоторые изменения в структуре коммуникации, в том, что представляет собой литература в этом огромном потоке, текст или скорее что-то более метатеоретическое.
Those are fantastic questions, and thank you for them. I answered the first one by saying that I don't think that reading is disappearing as a practice by any means. I do think that reading is becoming classed. So I think that there's a number of people who grow up being groomed for university, being read to a lot, being given books, and growing up with literacy at their disposal, and that market for novels particularly is still there, is quite stable. I think when you take into account population growth and the increase in wealth in developing countries, it's possible that the absolute number of readers is greater now than it ever has been before, right? So I'm not concerned about the death of reading or the death of the novel. I just have a suspicion that it's becoming confined to one class or one segment of the population. The novel, as I mentioned, is, in its Western context, a genre that grew up with capitalism, right? So if we can say that the world economic system started to develop in the early 1500s, and that its basic financial techniques were developed in the early 1600s in Holland and through the beginning of Portuguese and Spanish colonialization, that's exactly the moment in which Cervantes is developing the Ironic techniques and the hybrid of the romance and the story cycle that allows him to make Don Quixote, and which then spreads into England, Holland, France, kind of as these economies are integrated into global capitalism. So it's no surprise to me that the novels remain extremely popular. I find it telling that those novels, which have worldwide popularity, tend to fit some kind of narrative in which the main character is integrated into some kind of larger and more complex world of which they had no understanding at the beginning, right? So the most popular genres of novel are age story or the Bildungsroman. I think novels of fantasy, novels of conspiracy, the detective novel, right? Some forms of science fiction. I think these are genres that precisely have to do with the individual discovering themselves in a world that's full of mysterious forces. And the most popular novels are often the ones in which someone in the course of growing up discovers a fantastic conspiracy, right? So the Harry Potter or something, right? They can all be layered on top of one another. As for the second question about changes in the structure of communication, I do think that's happening. I don't know that we have the historical perspective right now to describe what they are very well. My feeling is that in 10 years we'll be better able to look back and figure out exactly what's going on than we can right now. I do think that that this feeling of something like the Facebook feed where there's a wide variety of information of different kinds coming at us from all angles, and something from our family comes side by side with something that has to do with intellectual research, for instance, right? These discontinuities where you have a couple of frames within a single object that take different pieces of our lives and put them next to each other without showing how they relate to each other, right? I think this has a great deal to do with modernist experience of discontinuity, yeah. So I think that's very, very important. I don't think that we understand it yet, but hopefully we will someday.
У нас, наверное, время есть еще для одного короткого вопроса до перерыва. Если полностью у кого-то образовался. Да, нет? Пожалуйста.
Можно просто маленькое добавление? Вы говорили про диалоги формы, вы говорили про идеологию формы, вы говорили про эстетический опыт, вот Аня говорила про изменение структуры коммуникации. Я думаю, что сюда можно было добавить то, что Williams называл structures of feelings, структуру чувствований, то есть по-настоящему, как мы взаимодействуем с инструментом письма и как взаимодействие проявлено в тексте. И если можно, буквально маленький пример совершенно. Вот вы упоминали роман Гибсона, и у него, собственно, известный роман, там первая строчка такая. The sky of the city was the color of television tuned to that channel. Это роман 86-го года, соответственно, понятно, для Гибсона that channel это вот один цвет. А спустя там 10 лет этот that channel это другой совершенно цвет. Для нас, как современных читателей, я не знаю вообще, есть ли какая-то ассоциация с фразой that channel. Что мы вообще представляем себе, когда мы читаем, какого цвета для нас небо, а когда мы читаем эту фразу. И мне кажется, вот в этом таком антропологическом измерении есть тоже очень много интересного, имеющего отношение именно к мировой литературе, потому что вот какие-то большие культурные формации позволяют этой самой структуре чувствований, позволяют получить доступ к этим структурам чувствований.
Yeah, it's a great observation, and I'm tempted to draw some kind of line of continuity between Homer's wine dark sea, which has perplexed philologists since the beginning of time, and something like Gibson's Dead Channel, which is obviously a color that's no longer intuitively perceptible to us. Yeah, the ideology of form, as I hope was evident, lay very deeply in the roots of my paper, and I think the references to Jameson and the Warwick research collection have to do precisely with how literary genres, not just in their content, but also in their structure, encode or reflect these larger economic structures that we inhabit, and we somehow sense but aren't able to describe rationally. And the value of literature, and this gets back to the earlier discussion about aesthetic objects, is precisely in that we somehow intuit when we like a text that it speaks to something in our experience or makes our experience perceptible to us as a sensual object, something that recommends itself to our feelings, that we cannot name or understand in its totality. totality. And so, again, just to go back to the literature one, because this is an example that Jameson refers to very frequently, so it seems quite relevant here. There's not just the biological experience that we share growing up, but also this experience of entering into a world which is much bigger than we are, and in which we're forced to interact with elements that are beyond our control. It intuitively speaks to our experience as human beings who enter into the structure of capitalism, and we want to be a part of it. We have no choice to be a part of it, and yet our maturity in becoming a part of it is also our subjection to the force of the plot, which takes us somewhere that we can't expect. I think one of the challenges that world literature has is to keep alive and relevant and find pedagogical methods of teaching to contemporary students the ways of feeling or the ways of sensing that are germane to other cultural contexts and other times, which are often utterly opaque to us, right? And yet, if we don't understand what it is that, even on the terms of like what a color is and how to match the palettes of the colors, it's very difficult for us to understand what the text is about. I often think in this connection of an example that David Damrosch gives of Sanskrit lyric poetry. And there's just 4 lines, and it's very simple, and there's this poem that says, "Oh, you have a swelling on your lip. You should not have smelled the lotus flower with a bee in it," right? And so, in the Western context, then we immediately like, okay, so there's a garden, right? And someone has been stung by a bee. But it feels very simple to us, and yet. We start talking about like, the structure of feeling in the Sanskrit context, ancient Sanskrit context, then what you're supposed to do is imagine the poem as being addressed to a bunch of different people. So you imagine the poem as being addressed to by a friend to a woman who has been bitten on the lip by her lover, and so it's an allegory of her like receiving this love bite, which is now visible on her. And we're supposed to say that she's speaking to the husband, who's also listening in, and she's making an excuse and saying, "Oh, it wasn't an adulterous tryst. It was in fact she was just bitten by a bee, right? So there's no need to be angry at her." And it's supposed to be addressed to the lover as a warning to say, "Don't bite so hard next time. Don't leave visible marks," right? And it's supposed to be an address to the reader to say, "Aren't I clever for saying so many things in one poem," right? So you have something which is which takes place entirely on the level of sort of lyric description of a garden, right? And sort of the experience of being stung on the lip, right? Which we internalize as, oh yeah, I've seen flowers, I've had bee stings before, right? But then in this other context where there's this entire different mode of reception, then out of those feelings we extrapolate an entirely different social world, which includes gender relations, which includes our expectations as readers, all kinds of things. And I think the most difficult thing, sometimes the most useful thing that we have as scholars to do is to discover and keep alive these other ways of transforming structures of feeling into hermeneutic methods or methods of interpreting and reading. Because obviously it's possible just to look at this poem and say, oh yeah, a garden, the way that we would read it in the West. But it opens up this whole other realm of possibilities for us as readers and as writers even, to think of feeling as having these other